All right. Well, welcome to the Monday, April 11th, 2011 meeting of the Brattleboro Planning Commission. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome guests, welcome staff, welcome commissioners. Good night, Moon. So tonight, strangely enough, we intend to get out of here by 8 o'clock.
Oh, good.
We have a very rich and fast-moving agenda. So, one of the things that, well, the town plan activity that we're going to do tonight is first a report on progress. I guess, is that what you guys are intending?
Just some of the things that we're juggling right now.
Yeah. Okay. Hits and highlights.
Yes.
Yeah,
something like that.
Okay.
3 quick points.
And then we're going to go over a couple of chapter outlines, one economic development and one land use. And there's been a lot of activity about each of those in the last couple of weeks. So the first order of business is to approve the minutes of the March 28th meeting, which was our last meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second? Oh, go ahead.
I'll second. Okay, thank you, Jim.
Any discussion?
I just want to see what happened.
The poetic pause. Huh?
I will say my discussion about it is that they're very complete minutes, and there was an awful lot that happened. And so my compliments to Julia. Julia.
Yep.
Okay, hearing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So the minutes have passed. Announcements, I just have one, which is, and I don't know if all the commissioners got notice of this, but there's a Wyndham Region Energy Roundtable meeting on Thursday night, this Thursday, the 14th, from 7 to 9 at Bellows Falls Middle School. And it's about energy project planning and implementation.
This Thursday?
This Thursday.
And the time again?
It's at from 7 to 9 o'clock at night in room 200 in the Bellows Falls Middle School, which is that school in the middle of town there.
It's on Cherry Street.
Cherry Street?
I think so.
Yep.
It's a cross street, right? No.
Yeah, like in between Atkinson and...
In between the two big streets, yeah. And I have the mailing that I got about it, if anybody wants to see
I'd
that.
just like to look at it.
Sure. Any other announcements? Okay. So, any other business? Any other business, I should say?
I have an item for this.
Sure.
The Wyndham Regional Commission has a panel of people. It's made up of commissioners appointed by each of the member towns. There are 27 towns. In Brattleboro, the tradition has been to appoint 2 select board members. There's currently a vacancy for those 2 positions. It's the time of year when they reappoint new commissioners. And there's no rule from the Wyndham Regional Commission or from the town of Brattleboro saying that it has to be select board members. And so the select board is making their appointments to those positions at their next select board meeting, which I believe is next Tuesday. So if there are regional planning commissioners, if there are planning commissioners here who would like to become a regional planning commissioner, you could write a letter of interest, address it to the chair of the select board, and you will be considered.
Just to add to that, I just had a conversation with Barb
Right.
about that, because I have been the last 2 years serving
Right.
as one of the select board members and plan to continue doing that, but there was interest a couple of years ago in having somebody from the planning commission. I think it's a good idea if somebody wants to do it.
Right. And I think of my experience with other towns, the combination of one select board member and one planning commissioner seems to be really effective. So
How long is the term and how often do they meet?
it's a term is for a year,
It's an annual
It's a
thing.
1
I
year.
think it's annually renewed.
and they meet once a month as commissioners, and there's an expectation that you might
Be on a
Put-
committee.
participate in a committee.
Have homework.
And have homework. So
Not,
the-
I wouldn't
not
say so much
huge.
homework.
The commissioner meetings
Depends on
are
what committee.
evening meetings, and they rotate around the region, so that's
okay.
actually good because you get out and
See the county.
see the county.
Yeah.
They're usually the fourth Tuesday, 7:30 to 9.
Right. And the committees tend to meet,
Depends.
actually, it varies, committee by committee. Some of them meet during the day, and
Mhm.
they meet, they
Okay.
each have different schedules, but, if that's one of your concerns, then, there's choices there as well.
And Dora, who's been your fellow commissioner the last couple of years?
Martha was the last couple of years.
Yeah. And Dana was at one time, wasn't she?
Dana was the year we did the whole planning commission thing. Dana was.
Yes,
Dana was
that's right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, she did it for a little while.
Right, okay. So, yeah,
And do you, is it a worthwhile activity for you?
For the Wyndham Regional, I think it is. I mean, actually, Wyndham Regional is really one of those boards that's really committee-based. So a lot of the activity that happens for the commission happens in the committee, and if there's a lot of choices. There's an energy committee, there's transportation, there's
Community development.
there's what they call the coordination planning committee, which is the committee that reviews all of the town plans and recommends for passage.
Natural resources.
Natural resources. So there's a number of committees, and some of them are really active and have a lot going on.
Yep.
And have their own meetings with presenters and all kinds of things happening. So, the monthly meetings, they're generally, they usually have somebody coming down to do some kind of presentation. So it's usually a learning experience that whatever you have, and like Rod said, going to the different areas and seeing the different towns and the different regions is it can be fun too.
Uh-huh. Well, good. Okay. Well, if anybody is considering that, I'm sure they can talk with
sure.
you guys about it. And,
Right.
I would encourage somebody to do it.
Do we need to have a representative again? I wasn't clear when you
We're
first
hoping
started.
to have a
Hoping,
representative.
okay.
Dora's hoping to re-up, and so that there's an opening for one other person. So if somebody here has an interest, then that would be really great.
Okay. Great.
I have other business.
Sure.
For you guys, as long as I'm here. And I presented this to the select board at the last meeting, but actually Betty and I were there at the community
Dora,
development.
just for our viewing audience at home, could you please say who you are and
Dora Google this.
where you're from?
Live in Brattleboro.
Thank you.
We went to the Community Development Association meeting last, actually it was the same day the economic development presentation at the museum. And there was a guy named Chip Sawyer who works for the state who did a presentation, I guess, in the fall sometime before he was working for the state, but he's basically he's the data guy for this.
He's a UVM extension. Yeah, he's been. Yeah, I mean, he's had the same position for a long time. But yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
He doesn't work for the state.
Oh,
The
He
right.
works
state,
for a
yes,
university.
which tells you an enormous amount. The state does not have a data guy.
Oh, okay. I was under the impression that when I read it, I thought he
There's this UVM extension guy,
What kind of data?
demographic
Well,
and
Census.
University,
Demographic
the university,
census,
the state
uh,
university, so doesn't he work for the state?
University isn't a
No,
state
it's just not,
university.
yeah, that's where it all falls apart.
You think it is,
UVM is not a state
but
university.
after about 10 or 20 years, they tell you that it's really not.
Once you send your kid there, you're sure not at state university, I'll tell you
That's
that.
part of your initiation into Vermonthood.
I don't have the thing because
Yeah.
I could have sworn.
You get your first tuition bill, you know it's not a state.
So anyway, he's really good at presenting data, and he also has an ability to engage people, and I was thinking it might be it might be a good idea to maybe possibly have him come down and do something, do a joint planning commission, select board meeting.
He did present data around the release of the census data information. In fact, Liz and a few other people loosely associated with the planning commission were present at that workshop held at the library late February. So I'm sure he'd be happy to come again, but he has been in town and people have met with him and listened to his presentation on the census data and on the ACS, the American Community Survey. So, and he and I have met in Montpelier around the latest update to the economic census data, which is a different collection. So, yeah, people here are somewhat familiar with his work, I guess.
So anyway, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people that haven't seen him, and what I was thinking was doing some kind of joint meeting with us, with you guys in the select board and other town committees and boards, so that everybody's kind of on the same page with all of that data and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So just putting that out there to you guys.
Okay.
Great.
I agree, it was really engaging.
Yes.
Stuff.
And just to add to that, so my name's Betty Fry, and I'm from Guilford, and I was really impressed with him and how up to date he was. And Dora and I did, that was the same night that was presented at the museum. And I did note at the museum, we came late to it, but there were questions about what was being presented, that it kind of stopped in 2007. And I don't know, I know myself in my own business that the world changed in 2008, 2009. And so there was a lot of rumbling in the room around me that were wondering about the relevance of those numbers. And we had just come from an event where he seemed so fresh and up to date with numbers. I mean, there were a lot of questions in the audience of him, and he seemed to be able to, come right back with really fresh numbers. So I think that that's what Dora's addressing.
Okay.
Maybe, it is time to bring him down under other circumstances, more of a presence down here. And frankly, I go to a lot of these, and I found him to be one of the most engaging and thorough people I've ever seen. I mean, he was the star of that whole event. Very, very good.
Okay.
It's nice to hear, because data sometimes can be very dry,
Yeah.
Exactly.
glazed over kind of
Should I bring it up?
You're
parts
not
of
kidding.
presentations.
I mean, they're just
Yeah.
totally engaging and up
And
to
we need to
date.
just set the register a little
Yeah.
bit. The data that Roger, the consultant, presented at the museum was drawn from what they call the economic census. And that's the easiest way to understand this is that it's in an opposite cycle to the demographic census, the population census. So the population census is done every 10 years. So 2000, 2010, 2020, and so forth. The economic census is done sort of in the off cycle. So it's
2002.
2002, 2007. So it's
Every 5 years.
every 5 years.
2 years off. of
2 years off of the census. So what you got there was the most recent information from the economic census, and what you want is to be able to observe the trends, which is why he went back, I guess, to 1997. That's not going to be updated in a meaningful way so that you could make comparisons until 2012.
If we have the dates right.
If we have the dates right. So, and so it's a different collection method and it's a different cycle. And Chip and I have talked about that. In fact, Chip and I were at the same presentation where people from the Census Bureau were presenting the new format for collecting economic census data. And then one of the last parts I want to add on this is that because Brattleboro is small and Wyndham County is small in relative terms, and because it's an economic census collection, there can be moments when if you collected the information and published it, people will be able to identify the size and performance of individual businesses, and so a lot of stuff ends up being blacked out because of that, and that's extremely relevant to the Brattleboro and Wyndham County circumstances. So even in big sectors such as forestry products, it's dominated by so few but large businesses that you
So you wouldn't
that
want
data's
to
not available.
have proprietary information be divulged. That's the
They can't.
Yeah.
It's one of the only way they can collect it is by promising that they won't do that. And so, you know, that which is somewhat the same for the census. I mean, because they have to maintain that trust. So, what I'd say is that somewhat in defense of the consultant, we talked about the population data, and that was up to date. That was using the 2010 demographic data. The economic census is a different category altogether, and everyone's aware that things clearly changed dramatically in 2007. The pattern, though, from back to as far as 1997 was still something that we wanted to capture, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2012. But everybody in the whole country is in that same situation effectively.
So we should just, at some point sit and talk about,
Yep.
how we might be able to do something like this. And it seems like it would be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think it's good to know how it's collected and what's involved.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Any other business? I like saying that. A member of the Bike Ped Coalition is here.
Yes.
Hi, Dana.
Hi, how are
Any
you
other
guys? Nice to see you.
other business?
Sorry I was late. I guess the issue of my tenure on the Planning Commission, might this be an appropriate time to mention under other business? It's not, it's more an
Sure.
announcement, but I've missed that.
Okay.
So this would be my last Planning Commission meeting, unfortunately. I've been on the commission for 3.5 years, and I have enjoyed working on it. And unfortunately, I just have other priorities that I need to attend to. So, but I am interested in continuing to work on some things, help as I can with the town plan, and also potentially with the Ag Committee and sort of work in that arena. So still sort of staying involved as I can.
Okay, well,
And I've enjoyed my time in working with you all.
it's been good having you, and
We'll miss
we would
you.
have had a cake if you'd let me know ahead of time, but
Oh, that would have
You
been
can
fun.
share my cheesecake with me.
Oh, I've been, it's been sort of inching along. Right?
okay. Well, thanks for all your work and all the time these last few years, and hope you will come back and participate, especially in the town plan process.
Yeah, I would like to.
Okay, any other so the next section, public comment, is for public comment that really isn't related to the things that we're going to be talking about in a little bit, and I don't know if either of you have public comment that isn't related to the public comment that you can make during our public work session about economic development and land use.
I made all my public comment.
Okay.
We might hold you to that, watch out.
So all I'm saying is you are certainly encouraged to participate in the work session. I'm sure that's what you're here for. So.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next thing is town plan activity report. Is that you, Sue?
Sure.
Do you want to start? Are you okay?
Yeah, I'll start. So just wanted to report on a couple of things. although not as firm as it was on Friday. The Agricultural Advisory Committee was going to get together next Wednesday, except 2 members can't attend, so we're trying to move that date. So they were going to review and discuss the agricultural chapter, which takes a little pressure off me because I was trying to do some updates to get it out. Anyway, I'll keep you posted as to when that is. Certainly you too as well, Dana. We're looking at either the April 27th or I think May 3rd is the following Wednesday. So we'll see what happens.
So will that be sort of on the lines of the energy committee work session, or?
Well, the Agriculture Advisory Committee hasn't met in probably 18 months, so I don't think it's going to be quite that. It maybe there'll be a meeting out of that afterwards, but it's really kind of a reorganization.
They're starting to need more of that.
That's,
Why is that? I'm just curious.
it takes a lot of time to be a farmer, is my understanding.
I think a lot of the folks on it are older, too. Sort of older generation of farmers, and just, I think they're just really busy.
In the past,
Hasn't
too,
taken
the Ag Committee has met for particular things, like when the school proposal was up on Upper Dummerston Road, they met to discuss the pros and cons of that and all that. And that's the kind of stuff that they meet about, usually.
The last time they met was the chickens.
No, they started working on a mapping project. They had a subcommittee.
Right.
Um,
But you're right, the chickens was a big moment.
yeah.
But there was a lot of work that, for the retreat farm, that was probably the last big issue.
So in a sense, it might be a bit of a reorganization meeting as well, and trying to rejuvenate and get them meeting regularly.
And they're under the
Maybe they want new
umbrella of the
members.
select board, or
Yes, they're appointed by the select board
Yeah.
directly.
do they get a charge from somebody,
They're-
select board? or-
Yep.
What about the chickens?
What would you like to know?
What about the chicken?
What was that issue?
There was a moment in the spring of last year when it appeared as if the population of chickens living in the residential district might actually be at least equal, if not exceed, the population of chickens living in the rural zone districts of town, because people were eager to have their own chickens in town. And so in an effort, the zoning ordinance defines chickens as livestock, along with other four-legged animals. And so there was an effort to have the Ag Advisory Committee give advice on what the chicken husbandry issues were in a residential setting with reference to safety and the living conditions of the chickens.
So we approved that.
We did.
Right.
And so,
5 birds, I think.
yes, and no roosters. You can't get a permit for a rooster in the residential districts. But you could if you're in the rural district.
I'll keep that in mind, thank you.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that you need to know.
Everywhere, you just don't know it. So.
Right. So they helped formulate some guidance for the DRB on permitting the keeping of chickens in the residential districts. This spring we have had a few chicken inquiries, but not quite so many as last year.
So the Ag Committee meeting, are you going to be at that meeting?
Well, it depends on when it is. If it's the 27th, that's my third meeting in a row, and I won't be there.
Yeah.
Rod will be there.
Yeah.
If it's the following week, we'll both be there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And you will be talking about the town plan?
Yes.
and-
Yep.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of,
That's
Sugaring
the-
is
that's the
the
main
purpose
thing,
of
but
it.
I'd also like to.
right,
figure out
and we think sugaring is beginning to wind up.
So
So,
it's there,
yeah,
Okay.
judging from our street, it's kind of getting to the end.
So it'd be the 27th or the,
May 3rd. I think
Yeah.
those are the
I think,
dates
yeah.
we're checking on with that.
Yeah.
all right.
There's been some attrition of members as well. Somebody just moved to Wisconsin, and Ginny Milkey spends more time in Montpelier, so she's now off as well. So,
Right.
so
Betty?
But I am imagine such a committee would be working full force in some way with the whole strolling of the heifers and that whole movement thing that's happening in June. Is there any kind of correlation or
No, it's
I don't,
connection?
I don't think with that committee. I mean, maybe individually as farms they do, but
Some of the members of that committee are involved with strolling of the heifers.
Right.
This is the official, Town of Brattleboro Ag Committee, though,
Well,
that
I
we're
was in
talking
out.
about.
I just always looking in communities to see where people are connecting,
Yeah,
where they all have common goals and dreams that they're.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's no formal link. But
There's no formal link. Okay, that's what I'm asking.
okay.
I also wanted to report on the education chapter. Gary, Jim, and I attended the town school district school board meeting last Thursday, and we had a nice discussion with them. I think they were generally supportive of the direction of the chapter. They liked the links to transportation and agriculture. They were really interested in the economic development chapter, and some of them were interested in all the other chapters, so that was good.
Oh, wow.
We talked about sharing, making the facilities more open to the public. How could it be used for more community-oriented activities? And they pointed out that the facilities are used for a lot of the rec department programs, and I think they really felt that they're at their max right now. Between all the other things that they have going on during the day and in the evenings. So that wasn't really something I think that they were looking to pursue. In general, they're not looking at any building additions or anything major. They're really into maintenance right now. Jim or Gary wants to add anything?
Margaret Atkinson, she said, really the biggest thing is that when you look at the numbers, the biggest problem the schools have in a lot of ways is the poverty rate in town, and so they, the encouragement, like Sue said, was to try to find ways for economic development to happen. So they were very, that's sort of the foundation kind of work that they would like to see happen, and that would help their cause quite a bit and make their jobs and all the jobs of all the people in the education system in town easier if people had a higher standard of living, of course. So. And I thought that was a good point, and probably a point we could make at every meeting about everything is we could boost economic activity.
I think it's a really important theme, for the plan as a whole. It's certainly something that we've been working on right back since the scoping group 2 years ago now.
Yeah.
So.
I also received some comments from the Union School District, and some were just some clarifications in the text. They added another goal. There weren't real substantial changes from them, so I do want to, now that I've met with both boards, kind of communicate back with the Union High School and still see if they are interested in having a working group to hear more about their goals and objectives, or did they just give everything that they felt like giving? I don't know if it's worth the time of putting together a working group, but if they're interested, I definitely would be interested in meeting with them. So keep you posted on that one.
Okay, all right.
I ran into somebody who works in the supervisory union, and he mentioned different things, and one of them was, talked about how would you say, for instance, that my little thing about community service and including more community service outreach into the community, and he said just a way to explore that would be just to come and meet with them and start a conversation with them, so that to see with the proper people but starting through the curriculum people at the supervisory union, and then the people who work that program. So it might be, not that we necessarily have to do that now, but it might be just a goal that says explore, just using that as an action verb, and then over the next 5 years that can just be something that's explored rather than if that
Yeah,
could be encouraged.
Paul Smith is the curriculum
Yes.
coordinator.
Yes,
and
I've been-
we've
yeah,
been
I've been-
working with Paul on this for
Yeah.
over a year now. I guess.
Yeah.
So this is community services relates to all these town boards?
Yeah,
Municipal
like,
government?
yeah, or even anything, but to have a little bit more inclusion into town stuff. There was, you probably were here then, a high school senior who had graduated and she ran for the select board and she said if she won, she would stay that year before going away to college. She didn't win, but that was, I don't know, I thought that was pretty amazing, you know, and really great. And people like Arthur Davis came in now, he's a town meeting rep, and he's just a senior in high school too. So including more community service onto different boards or participating in town government and whatnot. Just
And I
be-
did bring that up with this board.
Okay.
I asked them about, you know, if they would be open to having like a high school student be kind of a semi, you know, formal board member.
Mhm.
And Ron Staley, you know, said that they have had participation like that with high school students on the BUHS board, which I wasn't aware of, and he asked me to be sure that if we put this goal into the plan, you know, that we acknowledge that is happening and has been happening. So I wasn't aware of it at all, so I said yes.
Yeah, I did know about that.
Well, I don't think it's in the same way that
Yeah,
we're talking
that we're
about.
talking
No,
about,
no.
yeah. But I think, you know, the town school board sounded, you know,
Yeah.
open to that,
Yeah.
for sure, so.
Good.
Yeah, and Paul Smith, that's who I spoke with, and he's open to having a conversation about that and exploring what
Right,
kind of ways that could be expanded and if it really would work or not, and how to make it work, so.
Well, the community service program is pretty open-ended, you know, so
Yeah.
it's real, something that can happen fairly easily, so.
Okay. Two other items that we're working on in the office to do with the town plan. After the last meeting from the consultant on the commercial implementation strategy at the museum, we've decided that we're going to put together a small group of people who participated in that meeting, work through the data issues that were raised there, and look at the goals and objectives of the project, of the consulting project. Hope to clarify a few things that were raised at the meeting, and then be able to move forward to the next phase. And then the other thing is a very complicated chapter of the town plan is the housing chapter, and we are lucky because we have had a recent town-wide reappraisal, and so we have relatively fresh data to work with. Brian Bannon in our office is working with the Lister's office to develop, at this point, sort of a first cut, trying to analyze the range of housing by type and age, what we call effective age, and a couple of other criteria to try and establish, in a sort of broad terms, the housing environment in town. And then we'll hopefully be able to explore some more specific questions a little bit further on, but that started. And
So, Rod, would that be like single-family houses, multi-family houses,
Mhm.
apartments,
Yes.
that kind of stuff?
we're really lucky. Right back when Justin was here, so Brian's predecessor, so more than 2 years ago, we started working on defining neighborhoods in conjunction with the Lister's office. And so they're numbered. So the whole town is broken up into neighborhoods, and the purpose of that was that was part of the process for the reappraisal. And so we can now go back to those pretty small areas and make comparisons. So we can come up with a median house price by type for a particular neighborhood and compare one neighborhood to another. We can look at how many multifamily dwellings are in one neighborhood and compare that to another. We can look at the number of subsidized housing units in one neighborhood and compare that with another. So we can begin to characterize neighborhoods using the same data right across town. And hopefully what we can do is build a broad picture going to questions of being able to characterize housing supply and demand townwide, and then if we see significant patterns come out across neighborhoods, then start to talk about that. At this point, we need to figure out whether there are, I think the casual observer would be able to identify that there are distinct neighborhoods, but we want to be able to talk about those distinct neighborhoods in a more quantitative way than feel or appearance or something similar to that. So that's the first exercise, and then we think that will be important information to feed into a conversation amongst the various stakeholders in the housing world in Brattleboro. So that would include those agencies involved in providing subsidized housing or
Wyndham
below
Land
market.
Trust.
So Wyndham, so the Wyndham Housing Trust, Brattleboro Housing Authority, private landlords, realtors, and so forth, and begin to discuss the housing environment in Brattleboro in an informed way.
Would that include the homeless?
That's an interesting question. There's obvious ways in which, when you talk about housing, the obvious thing is to actually include talking about those that aren't. From our standpoint, we're talking about, we'll probably discuss the homeless population with reference to community facilities and municipal services. So Brattleboro has a pretty substantial commitment to homeless or those in housing poverty, and they're not necessarily the same categories. And there's shelters such as Morningside and so forth. So yeah, we expect to be discussing homelessness as an issue and the conditions of the homeless, but I don't think we've made a decision about whether it's going to end up in the housing chapter per se or not. I think maybe not, but
It'd be relatively easy to get pretty good numbers
yes,
from
Melinda and
inside from the
Yeah.
drop-in shelter.
I just got the recent numbers from the drop-in center. If you'd like them, I could send them.
oh, from Melinda, yeah, okay, yeah, right.
And one other question, will these neighborhood districts correspond to census plots?
Yes and no. I would love it if they exactly mapped on to census tracts or blocks. I don't think we've got that down perfectly,
Right.
but
More or less.
we'll rearrange this town to actually conform to that.
Now, if those were loaded into like Jeff Nugent's maps, then
Yeah, we're
then
gonna.
all you'd have to do is keep them up to date, and you could draw the lines anywhere you wanted and see things, right?
Yeah, we could rearrange the neighborhood boundaries, I guess. I mean, that's one of the things that we need to look at. Do the boundaries really work for us?
But if you wanted to change it and do a
Sure.
census tract,
And we are.
And
Jeff is at the Wyndham Regional Commission. He's a cartographer and
GIS
GIS person that we use. Yeah, we're going to load it into GIS here. So it's going to start off as sort of a GIS project.
and what about downtown? Because that was something that Andrea was talking
Yeah,
about.
it's a little bit more challenging. It would be great if we could get a hold of that data that BAB is, Building a Better Brattleboro, is interested in getting on the occupation, how much residential, how much housing there is downtown and how much of that is occupied currently.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit more challenging maybe than other neighborhoods, but I don't think it's impossible to get at.
Wonder
I
if
mean,
that
it's-
would be it seems like once this is done, we maybe want to have a bit of a guess as to how accurate it was. you know.
Sure.
And because it's going to be, you might have a feel when it's done, as to, you know, with this much more work, it could be
This much,
really, really
right.
accurate.
Yeah.
You know? Because I think it'd be a really hard thing to get, you know, without doing a house by house.
Right, which was what the
survey.
census was supposed to do, but actually
Yeah.
this time around didn't really.
Yeah.
And then I think Wyndham Housing Trust, I know, has done an update on the housing study, which I'm not sure of the scope of that, but I know that I can never remember his name. The guy.
Isaac.
No, the guy from Amherst that does their reports.
John.
John Ryan, that's right. John Ryan has
Yeah.
done a recent update for Wyndham Housing Trust. So I think
Has
we've
he
got
done one last little bit, or?
yeah,
Yeah.
in the last year.
Good.
Now, are some of these things data that you need before we write that, or you write that chapter, or is this kind of going to be part of the action steps that are part of that?
No, I would like to have this beforehand so that we
It's
can
like
have
current conditions.
we can have that material to discuss as we put the housing chapter together, I guess is the way we're thinking about it. One of the concepts that was presented in the Town Plan Advisory Group was the notion of what the author of the article termed transitional neighborhoods, and it wasn't a commitment to transition to a post-oil economy. It was, which would be good, it was the other kind of transition, which is a neighborhood that is sort of on the edge of blight, perhaps, and you know, if you can think of a spectrum with blight at one end and gentrification at the other, it was sort of tipping towards blight, and what small adjustments could you make to tip it back, not necessarily all the way to gentrification, but stabilize the neighborhood and encourage investment and commitment on the part of individual property owners. So we think that there could be some neighborhoods that you could characterize in those terms in Brattleboro. And so we'd want to explore whether that was appropriate to have that identified in the town plan, and then identify goals and objectives and
Kind of
action
things like,
steps.
a lot of times when gentrification comes in, it displaces the current people in the neighborhood,
Right.
and then they have no place to go.
Exactly.
And so that might be a goal or an action or something, you know,
To display,
to maintain that,
yes,
what you're
to maintain the
talking
balance. I don't think, to be fair, I don't think there's any real evidence of gentrification in Brattleboro, and
No, I was thinking
yeah,
other places, but just
right.
as a,
yeah.
If
Or-
only we had some gentrification around.
I'm glad you said it.
You could advertise for
Yeah.
gentry.
For gentry, that's right.
no, that might be more condos.
Non-landed
or
gentry.
Right, unlanded
Needed.
gentry. Right. Okay. So anyway, so that, yeah. So that, I didn't want to bog down in that too much, but that's
Yeah.
that's what's going on in the office.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is just a curiosity clarification question. So the goal of trying to find this information about housing, it's not just numbers, but it's trying to get at about the level of satisfaction of finding housing too for people. I mean, as long as I've lived here since the 70s, I hear the constant gripe of not finding adequate ways of finding housing and how to go about that in the community, and that it especially rentals are just high. You just as long as I've been here, I've heard that. Does that get involved in a town plan, or is that besides the point?
No.
I don't know if I'm
It's
asking
not-
that
no,
in
no,
the right
no,
way.
we need
I
to
don't
address-
know how to ask that.
Affordability, condition, availability, and I think that the one issue that's becoming more pressing is appropriate forms of housing for people in different stages of the life cycle, for want of a better term. So appropriate housing for young people just leaving home, appropriate housing for young families that's not just affordable but pleasant, or not just pleasant but also affordable. Housing choices for active seniors, which sounds always like dogs to me, but it's actually, it's a category of dog food. What more can I say? Jim knows what I'm talking about.
You have to be a dog owner to catch that.
So, sorry about that. And then, so that people have got choices, rather than having to leave the area to satisfy a housing need. So, we think that in certain categories or segments of the market, there is limited choice, and that's the feedback that we get from a large number of people. And even in other kinds of categories, such as townhouses or condominiums that are might be market rate, either as rental or home ownership possibilities, but are fairly easy to buy and fairly easy to sell because there's a stable market for those. So we're aware that there's many aspects of the market that are not well represented in the housing stock in Brattleboro.
Is this data collection for things that we're going to put in the town plan?
Yeah, or at least, yeah. I mean, in terms of goals, objectives, and action steps, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there a reach out that's being done to work with all the local real estate people that really have their thing? I mean, a lot of them seem to be my friends, and they seem like they have a lot of opinions.
We'd like to be able to separate opinion from
Fact.
About how it is.
fact or something
Well,
else.
What is fact? What is,
Well,
you know.
I mean, that's part of the
But, I mean,
reason.
They seem to, they're...
Part of the reason why we want to collect the data is to be able to draw a picture that's
Yeah.
reasonably balanced and objective, that presents the information in a fairly nuanced way, that doesn't deny people's anecdotes or stories, but can help them test their opinions out, and then get from that process, including talking to them, what kinds of reasonable goals, objectives, and action steps we can incorporate into the town plan so that the things that we're clear we need to address can be addressed. And so I agree, I haven't been here that long, but for as long as I've been here, people have talked about certain conditions associated with housing in Brattleboro, and there's other things that are a little more nuanced that are not immediately obvious to lots of people too, including we don't have large-scale subdivisions, or we haven't had large-scale subdivisions of any significance for a long period of time, and there's none in the works. And so we're not adding large amounts of new housing stock, which, so there's a big conversation to be had there and explore those things. But yeah, the purpose is to come up with goals, objectives, and action steps.
I think there's a decent chance that when the statistics that we can get at between now and the town plan writing will be done, there'll be a lot of doubtful stuff in there, or maybe not a level of accuracy that where you could draw as strong a conclusion.
Meaningful conclusions from? Yeah, I think that's a possibility.
And so and which is fine, but I sort of look at that like some of the energy stuff, that it wouldn't be a bad thing to have a goal be to get to that point,
Right.
because I think it's something that a lot of people have wanted to have happen, like the affordable housing group. We have
Yes.
wanted to have that kind of information for a long time, but everybody's kind of like, so how do you do that, and how much time and money would it take to get to a baseline, to find out where we are and stuff. So,
Right.
but it would be very powerful information to have.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So,
Okay.
Dora?
Just to take this in a slightly another direction, one of the things that the Housing Commission was working on before they folded was the idea of a rental housing inspection program. And they were just talking about it at the Community Development Association meeting, about the fact that they were working on this from a statewide thing. With putting something like that in there, in the housing, as one of the bullet points of trying to have something like that be a good idea. To work towards
speaking of
something
bullets.
like that.
Yeah.
That would be a bullet.
Does
Well, that is one of the biggest points of contention. I'm not saying it's good or bad,
Uh-huh.
because I think housing does need to be improved, and but that was one of the biggest points of contention in the last town plan and the housing chapter.
And housing that
And I think that kind of blew things up, that particular item. Now, if anybody out there in the home audience, well, anyway, it was a difficult, it was a point of contention.
Well,
you know.
apparently it was a big deal, because the discussion about it, because somebody brought it up when there was a question asked about housing, and somebody brought it up that was part of the association who had worked on the rental housing inspection program for
Yeah.
the statewide thing,
Right.
and talked about how they couldn't get, there were certain things that they just couldn't get past, and the whole thing, but from the perspective of the fact that we have a 50% renter population in town, and knowing how many people that I know of that rent, that are in buildings in which the landlord doesn't fix everything, and there's nobody to go to except to move
Yeah.
out of that apartment and
Right.
go into another one.
Right.
From the standpoint of just, that could improve the lives, just that could improve the lives of a lot of people who live in the community, so
There's a
I
lot,
get the
I'm just saying
political-
there's a lot, no,
There-
not even just political, but I think the economic part of it too is that,
somebody has to pay.
somebody has to pay for it, yeah, and,
You mean for the inspector?
yeah, and I'm not saying what we should put it in or not, I'm just saying that we should
That's
spend
what
some
I'm
time.
asking.
Is that the
That's
kind of
why
thing
I'm
that gets
pointing
in
it
the
out.
plan? So that we have an honest discussion when we look at the plan about what's really
Well,
happening in the community, or does
we-
that get
we
kind
might-
of glossed over with
We,
numbers?
well, I don't think anyone's setting out to gloss anything with
No, I
numbers,
know, but it's,
but
you can show numbers, then you can say,
there's been this discussion in this town for a really long time around the bigger question of building inspections for as
Maybe the building department.
right. So there's a gap there that is well recognized. I don't really know what the current, and I know all I know is that it's a very charged topic, and so the way we approach it and the outcome would need to be thought through very carefully. And at this point, I'd be guided by the kind of dialogue that the meetings that we're going to have generates. And I think the important observation that Dora made is that just over 50% of people in Brattleboro are renters, so it's not a category that we can afford to ignore.
Can I just ask,
Yep.
at present, you don't need a certificate of occupancy when you buy or rent a house?
You need to obtain a certificate of occupancy if you build a house. Not sure that we would seriously try and implement getting one if you were to buy an existing home, and you certainly don't need one to rent. It's fragmented.
Yeah,
Is
and
what I'd say.
it's not covering, a CO isn't covering electrical, plumbing inspections. It's strictly,
Well-
did you build it where it's supposed to be?
Is
Are
it-
you,
is it-
measure the
Is
setbacks?
Is it in conformance with the site?
Is it-
Yeah,
Well,
we don't
however,
even do site plan.
With lending getting so tight, though, in terms of like electrical and plumbing and that,
Yep.
really the insurance companies
Are the ones
are
that-
stopping, at least above two-family. It's the insurance companies that are actually getting roofs put together better and electrical systems upgraded at this point in history.
Yes, I think that's probably a fair
But that's
observation.
only on a, sale transfer, so if someone's owned a house for 30 years, it can still be. What I would actually be curious about, if there is going to be an inspector, which I'm not thinking is a good or a bad idea, but potentially where some resistance comes from is, what is he or she going to be inspecting? I mean, personally, I'd rather see what are the standards that we're actually inspecting for before there's inspectors.
Right.
Because ugly rugs and old rugs may be ugly, but they're not structurally unsound.
Right.
And
Well,
there's
that's
no
what I said,
building
claim.
inspections in the state of Vermont now, there's no code enforcement.
Yeah, there is for commercial buildings.
For commercial, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
but
I mean-
not residential.
They're not inspecting electrical, they're not inspecting plumbing. There's code based on fire and and accessibility. And those are the only things that get inspected.
And they did start a whole series of that. They started with very multiple units And
Yeah.
because I've lived in two different places over the 20 years I've been here, and both at different times fell
Right.
under that, and they had to check for, could you get out of the building?
Right.
It was there more, the accessibility, safety, and smoke detector, and
Right.
fire extinguisher,
They
just
do
basic.
inspect for that.
There is that.
I don't want to have anyone feel like don't think this is important. I think it's actually extremely important.
Yeah.
But I think we need to move on. And then
Yeah, we
the last, I just want to correct one statement here. We've got an hour left to do two things here. It's the practice in Vermont is that licensed trades self-certify. So it's not quite saying to say that there are no formal inspections that are scheduled for electrical installations or plumbing installations, but the people involved, the certified plumbers and electricians that do the work are certifying that they've done it according to a building code. The question becomes, what do you do if you don't think that's true or not? And there are mechanisms that consumers and residents, including tenants, can pursue to do that. So I just wanted not to leave it with the impression that doesn't happen. That
Licensed trades.
whether the licensed trades are self-certifying that their work meets the code and whether that's adequate is a good question, but we should have that some other place and time.
Yeah, so let's
move on.
Yeah, it's time.
And all these things that we've been talking about the housing data, they will rise to the top immediately when we start talking about the housing chapter, so
Yep,
rest assured.
can't wait.
They're there. They're there. So anyway, so let's go on to our public work session. We have it down for 90 minutes. In reality, it's going to take 56 minutes.
For both.
So
30 minutes, huh?
we'll have about just a little under 30 minutes for each one.
Right. Okay.
So,
Well, do you want to start with economic development?
yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a chapter outline that I developed. It's formative. The things, again, that I want to remind you of as planning commissioners that I want strong and direct responses to include the content of the goals and objectives and actions in particular, more than anything else. And I think what I've tried to do there is constrain myself when it comes to the number of both goals and objectives, and then make them also work in the sense that these are explicit things that the town has within its grasp. In other words, like many other parts of the town plan, there's a lot of things that influence the rate of economic development or the experience of economic development. Only some of those things does the town have a direct role in. So I've really tried to keep a pretty sharp focus on what it is the town can do. It, for instance, doesn't speak about recent initiatives by members of town staff or others around regional efforts or those kinds of things, and partly because I wanted to try and keep the focus, at least in this discussion, on the in-town things we can do. So, that being said, if there are questions that people have, I'm happy to answer them.
Go ahead, Liz.
What I've been learning is I think each chapter of the master plan could benefit from an overview of the poverty rate and the fact that there's been low growth in the past 10 years.
Sure.
Should we say something like that, perhaps?
Right at the beginning,
Right at the
rather
beginning.
than just the current conditions.
Just kind of it seems like that kind of colors everything that we're working on.
It does.
Do you see it as kind of a paragraph setting the context for the chapter, or
I don't know.
something?
Okay.
The thought popped into my head, but it didn't really gel.
So you think we should make a more prominent statement about
Yeah, you know, if you think about our meeting this afternoon about the Energy Committee, I mean, I just think that those are kind of basic tenets that are the existing conditions in the town that would influence
Right.
not only this section of the
Right.
master plan, but others.
Right, I think, yeah. Okay.
Is that in the first opening thing?
Of what?
Isn't there supposed to be like an opening?
For the whole town plan?
There isn't one yet.
There isn't
but
one
will
yet,
be.
but there will be.
But that's the kind of, what she's talking
Well,
about, the kind of thing that you would put in.
But it also could get lost there.
I think,
For those that are flipping around
Right.
and just looking for a certain
right.
chapter.
So the things that are absent right now in the economic development chapter include a vision, and we just go straight for the goals and the way the outline's organized. But I think, if I hear Liz correctly, she's saying that right up there, if not, it's hard to have a vision about poverty and flat growth. But I think that what I hear from her, and I think is important, is that we state, at the risk of overdoing it everywhere, that the overriding circumstances of this town plan are the fairly difficult economic and social circumstances that we're in. Because I think that does change the context in a serious way about what the priorities of the town plan should be, and by implication the priorities of the town, and then what are reasonable set of expectations about municipal services and a range of other things if we've identified or ranked those as being the most important priorities.
So that,
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Hey,
so that would be
she
on
must be a planner, I reckon.
current
must be.
conditions, right? I mean, that would be the kind of thing that would go into that.
Mhm.
So it seemed like what we're talking about is moving something from there up to there.
Yeah, I agree with Liz actually that a much bolder, stronger statement that the circumstances that we're in are exactly how I just described them. And so part of the reason why the vision thing is blank is that I couldn't quite get to formulating a vision. I mean, it's okay to have a vision about the future that's rosy, but I don't know how to frame the vision statement that is anchored in the current reality very easily, is what I'd say. Because I think on some level, perhaps it could be beneficial for the town to acknowledge the situation that it's in a little bit more fundamentally, rather than pretend that's not it.
Are there any drawbacks to
Saying that?
presenting? Yeah, I mean, that's just a question.
Well, I mean, it's the old problem. I mean, half glass full, half glass empty. Like, are you a downer or are you upbeat? I would say that the way to frame it is in terms of trying to identify the assets and opportunities that could do with being more aggressively pursued or more enthusiastically, developed. I think maybe that's the kind of language that I'm struggling to find.
Or the services that are needed
Yes.
because of the
Because of
population that we have.
the population that we have, and I think that in the work that we've been doing so far in the town plan, I think that the town's regional role is very important to acknowledge there. So, if you are living within the region, regardless of the 3 states, you may well find that your access to services that you need are better, are more readily available to you if you're living in Brattleboro than if you're in a more distant community. And so there are just sort of some fundamental kind of relationships like that are really important to understand about what makes Brattleboro Brattleboro. Right.
Is there a reason why the creative economy isn't talked about under goals? I mean, I realize that the arts section probably has stuff in there, but it's one of the real driving forces in our local economy.
Say arts and
Number
ag,
two,
when we're talking
number
about
two
creative
mentions
Yeah,
it.
agriculture,
I
there's
think-
nothing in here about agriculture either.
Number 2 mentions it.
I think number 2 is meant to mention it, and also somewhat more obliquely, I guess, agriculture, and then cultural. The creative sector does come up in
Under current conditions.
in
Six.
in objective 6.
I think that's a really good point, actually, about
It's-
actively
And,
talking about the creative economy. I mean, it's been, it's sort of been something
Well,
booming for almost a decade, like
Item
that
C, under current conditions.
Yeah, and then action 4. I don't want to sound defensive. What I'm saying is the goals I intentionally left pretty broad and didn't touch down on. I was very explicit about the work that needs to happen, which is the consulting project around the commercial districts. That's goal number 1. I think that's probably, in my mind, that's the top priority for the Planning Commission, and the top priority for this section, this chapter of the plan in many ways. Goal number 2, I was trying to write it broadly enough to set the geographic circumstances of Brattleboro pretty well, identify some assets that we could further explore and develop, and so things such as its location and our proximity to markets and the quality of life reference, which is the rich cultural and natural heritage, that I would say is both intended to satisfy questions about agriculture as a sector and the creative economy as a sector, because I think that's what it's trying to describe without being that explicit. But if you want to be more explicit, then that's okay. We'll make a note of that.
I mean,
Yeah.
What do we feel
To
is
me,
missing?
that's one of the issues
Yeah.
of the past town plan was it wasn't explicit enough. So if somebody can read this and they can think, oh, it's talking about this, this, and this, and somebody else can read it and it's talking about this, this, and this. And
Well, all I'd say there is that apart from the land use question, the land use issue, which is goal 1, I actually don't delve down into any sector in the rest of the goals, because it's expected that if you go further down into a little bit more detail through objectives and then actions, what you begin to find is that there's more of a calling out of specific sectors, including the information sector or whatever. And so I'm okay about putting it in a goal. Part of me likes
well,
the layering effect, but if it doesn't make much sense to anybody, that's okay.
I mean, if you don't want to put it in the goal
Yep.
because you want it to be more general, then it should be at least mentioned under the objective.
What is it? What is it?
Both ag and the creative economy, and there may be other things that
I mean, yeah, but besides mentioning them, what
What are you going to, yeah.
what wants to be said?
Well, when I think of,
Brattleboro, supports the fostering of a creative economy, and maybe a little background about the importance of that and the research that's been done showing that when you enhance those sectors of the economy, you tend to boost economic development, and arts and ag fit really well in terms of Brattleboro and the draw to Brattleboro, and then tying that into sustainable businesses, green business, all of that stuff, tourism, blah blah blah. It's sort of all.
I think this is the place where are we going to have do we have an arts chapter per se?
Right.
And we do have an ag chapter, so
It's
there
gonna be
can be
cross-
a connection, there's a connection. They're all interconnected, but, so the more specifics can be in those other chapters. But when I think of economic development in our town, and that was a big thing from the scoping group, I see one of the things here is that we are an arts town, that agriculture is coming up to be an economic driver, and energy is an economic driver, not in terms of energy efficiency and, not driving as many miles, but energy in terms of becoming
Green businesses.
green businesses, and either working to explore those or whatever, and how those relate to the town plan, and people like, again, talking about in places like Oakland, California, they're taking the poor populations and they're creating training programs for them and having them go out and do energy efficiency projects or helping put solar
Well,
roofs on or
so
something, but,
it's about actions, right? And,
Yeah.
and when you look at under actions,
That was last week.
number 4,
Yeah.
that action step is revamp the small business assistance program to target existing viable businesses that can grow in value and employment in sectors that are growing, i.e., and that's creative and food processing. I mean, that could include agriculture. I mean, I think that, isn't it
Yeah, I
that we
think
want
it's
to get an
probably-
action step in there? And if
Yeah.
that's a meaningful action that we can
Yeah.
take,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
I think that's a great number.
isn't that the point, really?
Yeah.
And it's there, whether that, I don't know about that program, is that
The Small Business Assistance Program?
that's the town,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the.
And
from
what
the
if there's
block grant
other-
money?
if
Yeah.
there's other programs to do some of these things, we're not identifying them. So do we want to identify specifics, or do we just want to say programs that foster these kinds of assistance programs? Because otherwise, if you put just one program,
Well,
It's
I
the-
think we want to be specific here
There's a,
because it's an action that the town needs to take. This is our program, and it's something that we can affect
Okay.
change in.
Right.
If we're talking about a program that's federally funded, I mean, we don't really have that say. I mean, we don't want to make use of it, but this is something that's within the town's control because it's our program.
the town has funds that it has derived from participating in previous community development block grants. That's called the VCDP program, so the Vermont Community Development Program. Just the creation of just the establishment of the Commonwealth Dairy, for instance, means that we're going to get a substantial amount of money paid to the town over time that will boost that fund. So it's one of the few moments where I actually do have some levers to pull,
okay.
right? And a lot of the other things we don't have direct control of. That program, the Small Business Assistance Program, has been in existence for a long time. It's contributed to many of the businesses that are fixtures in town. It's been really important. You could go up and down Main Street and identify
Okay.
businesses
I
that have
wasn't aware
benefited
of
from
that.
it. So but
that's
it does
very
need to be,
specific.
yes, and that's precise. And it needs to be rejuvenated or improved in terms of its performance, and it's about to get a boost in terms of its resources, which is why it's
So
there
your
specifically.
word of revamp then
Yep.
is a good word then for
Yep.
that.
Yep,
Revamp
so-
and or revamp and utilize.
Right. So Gary,
Where
I
are
think
we
there's
right now?
there's
What-
there's two
Actually,
hands up
item
here.
number 4.
We're talking about that
Dora?
small business
Well-
assistant.
A couple of things. Can you add language also to say something like encourage other kinds of programs that would also help, so that you're calling out that which is a specific thing the town can do, but there's also a lot of holes that the SBAP doesn't cover that businesses and people who are looking to try to, create something, need help with. So if you include language like that, that encourages promoting that kind of organizational development, that then you layer something of importance, and it's not just the one program. I think that might help with that might help with it.
I'm sorry, Dora, did you want us to encourage use of those other programs or encourage new programs?
I suppose both, because there's some programs out there that could be more utilized, and there's also things that aren't covered by a lot of the programs that are out there.
Well, maybe it would be
Well, hang on.
something like to make sure that there's an effort in town to be looking at
Right.
at developing new programs.
Yes.
Right.
Something like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I
Sure.
think that's what I meant when I was
All right.
saying be more general. I didn't.
The one reservation I have about that actually is the resources that would be required to administer anything extra on the basis of our experience with this one. So, just want to have a cautionary comment there about it might be better to start with
This program.
this one
Yeah.
before adding others. So, once we're happy with the performance of this one and we still observe gaps, then that's certainly something that we could do.
But this is for 5 years, so there could be something there that, again, says explore for the other
Yeah,
categories
sure.
in the
Well,
future.
if
Yeah.
in the next 5 years, we can really use and revamp this program, I think that'll be a great
Yeah.
accomplishment.
Oh,
So-
okay.
Yep. So Dane's had a hand up for a long time.
I just have like a question and sort of throwing out there as to whether you would want to consider talking about living wage jobs or like high road employers, or even, talk about that number at all. It's like $15 an hour, or it's higher. Like it's sort of for
Yeah.
Text.
for Brattleboro,
I
what
think
is
it's
considered a
I think
living
that's a-
wage job.
I think that's something that would come out in text. A couple of comments on that. I think that's something that needs to probably be developed in the current conditions section. So I think that's a good observation to make. And then I think the other part about that is at a regional level, the Southeast Vermont Economic Development Strategy Group has got kind of a manifesto, for want of a better term, and that includes a commitment to increasing the number of livable wage jobs in the region. I'm sort of on the fence about it, whether the town can actually exert enough influence to bring them about to some extent. I mean, I think it's a good regional goal to have, and it's certainly an aspirational goal, and so I think it's appropriate at that level.
Yes.
But I'm not sure, given the actual mechanics of how jobs get made and lost,
Yeah.
whether it's something that we could really, because I don't want to give
It's
the
nothing
implication
you can
that
mandate,
that we
But is
would
this
monitor
something
the
you can-
city in cities like LA, or there's a bunch of cities across the country where they actually have implemented fair wage policies, and there's a monitoring component that goes along with that, which is okay, but there's a cost to doing that. I'm not sure if I want to encourage that expectation unless we could really commit the resources to doing it.
Because that number could change.
Well,
Yeah.
5 years from now, what's that?
if it's a mission though,
I think it's important to say that we want to create
Yeah.
jobs
Like
with
the
livable
jobs.
wages rather than, I think we need to be nuanced enough in what we say about economic development. And I actually should back it up a little bit and say, overall, the scope of this, if you go back maybe to the principle, and I was also thinking about this with reference to the vision statement, I would prefer in some ways for this chapter to be framed in terms of community development rather than strictly economic development, and have a more community development focus to it. And I think that as background to this, there have been times in the past when the planning office, for instance, has had a more community development focused portfolio of concerns or issues that it pursued in terms of its staff and the kinds of programs that it was involved in. I think in other towns this size or larger, it's not uncommon to have a community development worker or a community development position, or at least
Liaison.
that be part of the focus. And it goes back to Liz's comments too about the social circumstances, not just how much growth we're having, but the actual experience of living here on the part of a broad range of people. So I guess trying to get at things like a livable wage or something like that, I think are important commitments if people feel like that needs to go in here. I am a little challenged on another level about what role the town could actually play in achieving that. So for instance, I don't know if everybody who works for the town is on a livable wage. Okay. Just to put
Yeah,
it
I
in.
think more as a sort of, this is what we're aiming for as a
Yep.
town. That
Yep.
kind of
Yeah,
that
like
discussion, and maybe
aspiration,
even
like
that
you said,
education.
specifically.
I mean, maybe an employer has really no idea about the actual cost of living here and what it does take to maintain a, sort of
Right.
basic
Jim, did you?
lifestyle.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of related to what these guys were saying, and the living wage and the types of jobs that potentially we want to bring. We talk about the creative economy.
Yep.
Or the sectors that are growing, and we use creative as one.
Mhm.
And here, I've noticed this sort of in the various places I've lived. Here, when we talk about the creative economy, we think of it as arts.
Right.
And pretty much everywhere else I've lived, when we talk about a creative economy,
Okay.
it's arts
And
plus
yes,
really knowledge workers,
Yes.
which is
No, yes.
programmers, sustainable
Right.
engineering type people, high tech,
right.
architects. And if I believe that we need a different word
Yes.
for that, because here it's culturally acceptable that creative is arts.
Yeah,
And if we don't come up with a different word, I believe it gets ignored.
I agree,
Or
and that's
define it accurately, but
Right.
put the definition.
I inserted information
Yeah.
in objective number 6. That's part of the reason why I was actually trying to. That's why I used the sector, the information sector. That's what that's about.
There.
And that's also part of the reason why things like individual sectors, whatever it might be, did not feature very prominently in the goals, because I think there is some fuzziness. And here, creative has become dominated by, it's like a pseudonym for the arts. And I agree with you, everywhere else I've ever been or seen it referred to, it's not. It's a much broader category about what constitutes creativity,
Yes.
like creating product or services that are outside of the normal.
It's more
Normal.
knowledge worker.
Yes,
based.
yes, exactly. And I'm happy to use knowledge worker as a label if that is if other people
Well,
are
it does
comfortable with
Well,
it.
encourage
no,
living
because
wage.
it's not only knowledge, it's like artisans
Ignorance.
and that whole like light manufacturing side of
Well,
things.
maybe there's a good word.
We just have a real
Phrase.
strong art.
I mean, that's the
Yes.
word used
Community
in
here with
any
a
But
lot
it's
of
not.
these
It's not to
proactive-
diss them or try and
No.
constrain that. But I hear Jim's point. Jim's a member of this sector, and
So
so
am I.
and so's
The
and
knowledge
so's
worker
Liz.
community.
Yeah,
Yes.
closely with it in New York
And we
City
don't-
for many
Right.
years.
It doesn't
The
get
neglected
acknowledged in this
community.
community because there's such a push on the other side of arts.
Dora?
That's Liz
Right.
with it.
Did you
Well,
have?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, and certainly the issue of having community development focus for the town is an important one. It's something that some people have mentioned. We used to, I guess, have a community development person. We don't now, and probably won't for a while. So,
I think we're dealing with 50% less than we thought we had last
but,
week.
you know, that being said, if we're identifying a need and we're identifying something that, an action step that the town should, or maybe we don't want to say it's an action step, maybe we say it as an objective, but working on community development and developing some entity that is, you know, that's the town's, you know, you know, whether it's a board for economic and community and development, which I wanted to push for a couple of years ago and want to try to bring it back again this year. So at least we have a town board that's focused on that. Certainly, we know that boards that don't necessarily have a staff person that's responsible for it don't, you know, it may not have as much effectiveness as some other boards. But if that's an important thing, and we know that that's one of the keys to doing economic and community development, then there should be something that the town, that some kind of objective for the town to develop an entity that's responsible for that.
Well, maybe that would be an action statement of exploring whether the practicality
To get that objective?
of that, you know,
Yeah.
from the whole way around, you know, I mean,
Well,
because there could be.
exploring the practicality really comes down to, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I did.
You're learning my trait, watch out.
Exploring the
Get in trouble.
practicality really comes down to how we choose to prioritize where we put our resources.
Yeah.
So it's practical if something else, if we either raise more revenue or put something else on the back burner.
Well, for instance, if exploring the practicality to me would be does it look like a slam dunk if you figure out, you know,
I see what you're saying.
if such a person focused on community development could make some things happen,
Mhm.
you know, they could possibly fund their own position by their activities. So, I don't know whether
I
that's
hear you.
far-fetched or if that's reasonable to
Yeah.
think of. I
No, I
mean,
think it's
I think in the old context, I could see it more clearly. I think in the new context of community development block grants been cut in half
sure,
as an offer
right,
from somebody to somebody else,
yeah.
for instance.
Well, I'm just
Which
saying,
makes it a little
does
bit,
it
yeah.
make sense for other than on the back of an envelope figuring whether
Right.
this makes sense or not,
Yep.
to really explore it? That's
Well,
all.
we have a democratic process.
Well, we can put all that stuff in here.
So you should have that as an objective, is that true what you're saying? Okay.
So I don't know if that, I mean, I
Yeah, I
agree
think,
with Dora, I
right.
think about this, but I think that it would be a great thing, I think, to figure out whether we can do it or not.
Right.
And, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, BDCC does some of what that person might do, maybe, it just gets down to who does what, and
Well, I think that's
on
sort of-
whose behalf is it, and what's the most practical way to do it.
I think that's one of to me, you're putting, as a worker here for the town, I think you're beginning to put your finger on something that's interesting to me, which is there's a very vibrant and actively organized and well established not-for-profit sector in this community around community development issues, and along with a lot of others. And I can never really be sure whether what's needed is somebody, or that for this for the town as an organization to add resources to that or add focus to that, or whether that would be duplicative and redundant, and that these people are actually fairly effective at coordinating themselves as it is, that they know where the money is, they know what they're going for, that they don't, that another person adding to the mix wouldn't necessarily lead to an improvement in the outcome. Then I look at other communities where there's very clearly a commitment in that way, a staff person, or that's at least part of the focus of a town department or something similar, and you see results there that make you think. So I'm never really sure here whether people like it the way it is. Effectively, those people involved in the industry think that the way they've got it now is the way they really want to have it, or whether there's an alternative model there that should be explored. I don't,
I just, the Sevens meetings,
Yep.
and that they would come up with, is it four targets?
What
And
means?
the
Southeast Vermont Economic Development Strategy, otherwise known as
four really
SIVES.
distinct targets
Right.
with timeframes and everything, and to not have a person whose
Pursuing
job it
that.
is
Yep.
to make those things happen in town. I mean, maybe that's Barb, I don't know,
Well, it's a good question. Those
But
are the
is
Yeah.
it,
Right.
so, you know what, we're 35
Yep, into this.
60ths of the way through the rest of our meeting lives here,
So, the only other thing I
Two
want to draw
things.
people's attention to quickly is the new market tax credit zone,
yeah.
because that's sort of a land use / economic development. That's where two things come together very clearly there. Right now, the new market tax credit zone is everything. It's a census tract. That's the area that is the zone. Roughly speaking, it's everything south of Route 9 to the border of Guilford. And the eastern boundary is formed by
Corner of Guilford.
The
the,
state line or just Brattleboro, Guilford?
well,
Five.
Route 5 and then the road to Guilford Centre. To the town line between Brattleboro and Guilford on Route 5.
Okay.
All right. So the eastern boundary is formed right now by Elm Street, and it's the Frost side of Elm Street is in the new market tax credit zone, and the Flat Street of Elm Street is not. Okay, so that block with the New England Youth Theatre in it to the Main Street is not in the
No.
new market tax credit zone, but
They're in the downtown.
right. Well, you could have a new market tax credit zone and that
So
encompasses
Sir
downtown.
Sosimo and the new warehouse are in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we developed a little bit of expertise because of the Commonwealth Dairy Project, because that is in the new market tax credit zone, on what's involved in doing it, what the scope of actually doing a project like this is. And the big news is that I think probably following on from the Commonwealth Dairy experiment, Housing Vermont is now participating in the new market tax credit program. Both housing and, there's a wide range of activities that are eligible for new market tax credit credits, including housing. So that's the reason why you'll see it turn up as explicitly as it does.
Now, that's about economic development.
It's a fairly new tool. It's fairly complicated, but it is a tool for economic development. Yeah, and for instance, it might change the way we feel about what should happen in that district, right? In terms of land use.
So,
That's it.
Any
other comments?
Another program, really.
Yep,
besides
exactly. It's an
the-
explicit program
Yeah,
that we're focusing on there.
Yep, okay.
All right.
Two quick things, just when we were back talking about the livable wage business, and you talked about it as an aspiration. I remember Sarah Edwards at the last meeting when we were talking about energy and things we could control and couldn't, but that to have those broader goals that maybe aren't within our purview, like we couldn't control the rails and what we want, but to put in there that we support that or we look for how that is a part of what we want. And I think it sounded like that's what you were talking about in the living wage, so that we're aspiring to that, but it's beyond our immediate control, but it could have greater effects on a state regional level.
Right.
And to be sure to include those things.
Right.
I just,
We really have to go into the next thing.
Just give it to me in an email, Dora.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Or do that.
Okay, we're going to leave that for now. Remember, this is the draft of the economic development chapter outline. So we've got at least a couple more steps to go here. So
That was useful getting, I had no idea about some of these different,
Oh, good. Great.
the SBAP and all that stuff, so that was great.
okay, so land use is our next item.
Do you want me to? You can talk to me in sign language, and I'll talk if you want. Do you want to do it like that?
It's all right. I can
If you break down,
give you a quick overview.
I'll just make it up.
So we need two maps with this chapter. So we need an existing land use, which you'll see discussed under the current conditions. An existing land use is not focused on the zoning map. It's kind of what are our overall patterns of development. So I've broken it down, and we can have it. There's probably some missing. There's residential land use, there's commercial land use, industrial, there's public and semi-public uses. I kind of forgot the kind of open space uses as well. And then we have future land use, and again, it's not a zoning map, but it is, it is the basis for zoning. So any zoning changes that are made in the future need to conform to this map, generally. So here, it follows a little bit more. What I'm proposing is to kind of follow a little bit more like some of our land use categories. So for residential, we've got a higher density residential and a lower density residential, the rural residential being the lower one. We've got the commercial and industrial land uses. We've got the downtown and the village centers. Those are really the compact areas. And we have our rural land use, which we do allow residential development, I think at a density of 1 unit per 3 acres, which is pretty dense for rural. But I think the main focus of our rural land use is to kind of, there's a lot of development restrictions or constraints. And so it's where a lot of our forestry takes our, kind of our open tracts of forest land, our agriculture, a lot of it falls in the kind of rural district as well, so. Don't really talk too much about commercial in this draft, just because we don't know what kind of the recommendations will be. We do think there'll be at least some more residential mixed use probably up on Putney Road, kind of consistent with the Putney Road master plan. So I need to coordinate with Jeff to start the mapping on the existing land use, which will maybe help make more sense to you. He's got a couple different methods that he uses to create an existing land use map, so we might look at the different building categories of buildings and kind of see patterns that way. Really, the direction for this chapter is that we want to redo the zoning ordinance and the subdivision regulations. We've discussed the challenges with them. We've made some changes, but we'd like to make them easier to understand.
So this, in a sense, this chapter really directly will call out what will need to be changed.
Yeah. In some areas, like
in
I was
broad
specific
terms,
about
right.
the planned unit development.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that there's no debate about that are really important and that we need to call out, if for no other reason than that if there are explicit development projects that are mooted between now and the implementation of this plan, or the first couple of years after this plan's implemented, people should get it flagged that this is a high priority. So planned unit development falls under that category, under that heading.
Okay.
Yeah. Jim and then Liz.
Is this the section where housing is addressed, or is there a whole separate section?
This has nothing to do with housing. Just that houses are on land in this town,
Okay.
but that's it.
However, does zoning get addressed here?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
This is what
It's really what
It sets
from our
the
perspective.
yeah.
From our perspective, this is about
Yeah,
zoning.
in a limited way, this is where the zoning gets discussed, and so
Okay.
without like tipping your hat to saying what kind of what the new zoning will sound or look like.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
And to that, I mean, there is some. We've already picked out a couple areas that we need to look at. You know, the waterfront down on Depot Street. Should that be industrial? Should that be changed? You know, that would show up in the future land use map where we
Right.
have those discussions.
So if this is the appropriate place, it got brought up months ago in my very first week here, but I've heard it since. We never really, at least since I've been here, we haven't really had much of a discussion around infill.
right, right.
And is this the place where that discussion would happen, or is it in the housing section?
Nah.
It'd be here.
Yeah,
I say
there's zoning
hesitantly.
to do that.
I mean, yeah, what I understand you to mean by infill housing is that parcels of land with older, smaller homes could be redeveloped to have more.
Yeah, higher density within walking distance of
Right.
downtown or West
Right.
Brattleboro, which I think solves transportation issues.
Exactly, and
I think
that's
you've gone
part of
through
what and we'd like to match that up with the discussion of housing to some extent. So part of the purpose of identifying particular neighborhoods and characterizing them in particular ways is trying to say, okay, this happens to be a neighborhood that meets all these other criteria. It's walkable in and of itself. It's accessible to the downtown by walking and other key facilities like schools and whatever it is. And so we think this is where this kind of activity should be focused. And if that then is matched in the land use chapter, then that gives direction to the Planning Commission, who then drafts the new zoning ordinance and subdivision regulations. Yeah?
So
So
the
this
big
kind of-
objective one is meant to get it infill.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
Go ahead, Liz.
well, is that's number one?
Yeah, that is number one,
Well,
exactly.
I wouldn't say that they're ranked in priority order either.
Oh,
It just
but
happens
I
to be
see.
number one.
I
It's not.
see.
It's not
Right,
ranked
right.
number one.
Okay, so that could
Yeah.
fall into
Yes.
this.
Yes.
When we go have these discussions in
Yep.
9 months after we.
Sure.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yep. Liz.
I just wanted to make sure I understood, because in New Jersey, when you're changing the zoning, it has to meet the master plan. Do we have to spell out now all of the elements in the zoning plan that need to be changed and present them in terms of why they need to be changed, what the basis for that change is, and then go about and changing them so that they agree? And they're like legally linked?
I think
Yeah, that
that's
sounds
the
like
way.
a great place to be. I think I might move.
Well, I think
Sue's now going to explain how it's done here. You kind
that's
of
not
like.
been the way in Vermont. Vermont is moving, I think, more towards that. So I think where we can be explicit is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't think it's been tested yet.
Right.
Where
More
it
people
hasn't
from New
been.
Jersey need to move here first.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't do something that.
That'll be right in the zoning.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Sure,
Like,
you
I
want that,
wouldn't-
Need to see a
that,
driver's license.
you want that objective in the economic development chapter then? That's more people from New Jersey?
That would be nice.
Well, I think like on the,
Okay.
on the future land use map, I wouldn't take an area that's industrial and then change it to residential without, I mean, you want to be able to make the link to the plan. So I think if we're talking about how can we have better subdivisions or, like right now, we don't allow for conservation subdivisions, we have the PUD.
Right.
So I mean, I want to talk about the issues so that you can make that link to the town plan.
Yeah, just kind of make that link so that
People know where.
nobody
the issues are.
sues you and says
Yes.
you made this willy-nilly decision
Yes.
and your master plan has no basis for it. What's
That's
up with
happened
that?
at the Active 50 level.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm
it
sure.
do- it does
but I
happen
know.
here,
I
and
mean,
so-
that's
And we
why
have
we
to,
do
when
this.
we write an ordinance, we have to, at the beginning, we have to talk about, we have to reference the town plan.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So,
So
Yeah.
part of the little trick here is to have the general flow and direction of the town plan configured properly, so that when you rewrite the zoning ordinance, it does conform to what is discussed in the town plan. And that's why little things about the level of specificity in one place versus another end up being maybe a little bit more important than you're used to. But yeah, there is this way in which you have to check one document against the other.
Because you kind of have to know where you're going with
Yep.
the zoning to write this,
Yes.
to be the underpinning for
Right.
it.
Well, and I think that there's some areas that we know of, so we can put them down on paper.
Yeah.
I'm sure you do.
Just a few.
Dora?
Just a couple of questions to sort of get everybody thinking. One is, should we specifically talk about smart growth principles?
So what kind of principles?
Smart growth
Smart
principles or something related to that, if you don't want to call it smart growth.
Average.
Should we be thinking about establishing greater, because Jim is talking about infill, and there's places where we would probably like to see that happening, and then there's other places where we
Right.
wouldn't, because they're
Yes.
historic districts. So should we be talking about creating larger historic districts, particularly the neighborhoods around, this area that have all those great historical homes that we don't really want to see torn down and have other things built?
Well,
Dark Everett will thank you.
Yeah, hang on.
He will.
Just hang on. Yeah. What, I just want. I feel obligated as a planner to say that first of all, bad things happen to nice houses, like they burn down, and not intentionally. They just sometimes it happens. And then it is not necessarily always the case that you cannot have infill housing that's compatible with a historic district. There's a set of requirements that you have to kind of meet before you can expand or change the boundaries of an historic district. We've gone through, it's a fairly rigorous process in Vermont. We've gone through it for the village center of West Brattleboro and the downtown. You don't get to just adjust the line without a fairly rigorous review process. So all I'm saying is You can do infill that's sensitive to the context of the neighborhood, and it can be new. Yeah. Yeah.
I totally see that, Rob.
Right.
But we don't have standards that are going to allow for that right now, and so that needs to be mentioned.
Well,
Right.
And the idea of increasing, the idea of increasing the historic district, I'm throwing it out there as a discussion point.
Right.
And that is that, do you put it in there as some sort of goal, that the idea of expanding the historic district, even though we know how complicated it is to do that, because that identifies it as an important characteristic of the community from land use perspective.
Right.
Is there a section of the master plan for cultural resources and historic preservation? Or is that going to be in the land use section?
That's a good
it's
question.
kind of been floating
Straddled.
out there because
Yeah.
it was going to be with arts and culture. And
Some
it's
place
still
where
kind
you
of
would
rejected
have,
it.
have a
The
map
inventory
that
of
shows
We
the
keep on
existing
kind of pushing it
districts.
around, actually. It's not,
And
it
that's
hasn't
sort
found a
of
home in the
corrected
town
design
plan, and it's a good
standards.
point, because I think this is going to that, and it is something that, from a legal standpoint, with reference to future land use, we probably do need to pin it down and have it kind
Yeah.
of fixed. So that's a good point.
So can we put it in this chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to satisfy all the historical resources in Brattleboro, talking about the districts, but, so we still have to resolve where the rest of those
Also,
resources
just
go.
You could put it in both, it connects, you put it in the land use thing, and it gives it a level of importance that.
Well, I think the districts definitely should.
Yeah. I think the districts would be, I think both the village center in West Brattleboro and the downtown
Canal.
and Canal Clark would figure in the land use section of the town plan.
And it doesn't warrant its own?
Well, I'm open to it. I want to definitely say that because they are designated districts, they'll be mapped and discussed, or at least described in the land use chapter. The historic and cultural resource thing, in a more general sense, still needs to be, the place in the town plan for that still needs to be identified, and that's a concern now.
Does that have design standards too, different things?
There
for the
are,
historic
you want to talk about that?
I don't remember all the ins and outs, and
Right.
it's
Yeah.
really kind of foggy right now.
You understand?
Yeah, I really can't. I think if you're
Going out there more and
I
more.
mean, ideally,
trying
you're
go
going to
home.
follow the National Park Service guidelines if you've got a house.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the requirement is.
It varies to whether it's if it's a private residence, then there are there's a certain level of restrictions in
Yeah.
play. If it's a institutional or a commercial building, then and particularly if you've been a recipient of some form of there are
Well, if you federal funds.
if you've
or
ever
if
received
got a
federal
historic
funds or
easement.
there are conditions that apply, and it gets stricter the bigger and more complicated the building, I guess. So yeah, I don't want to bog down it
That's
right
all
now. But
sort of enumerated in, like in the
codified.
West
So we don't
Brattleboro,
have to have that
Brattleboro
here.
Village,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think
Yeah.
we need to talk about it right
Yeah.
now. I'm glad you brought it up.
I mean, well, I
But,
guess,
yeah.
I mean, like the latches, that has really strict
Yep.
requirements. They need.
Yeah, I was thinking of that, because a lot of the downtown buildings have very
Yep.
different kinds of facades and font.
Right.
Well, to that, there was an objective in there to establish guidance for design. When Bob Stevens was here at the last meeting, he mentioned the design guidelines that were done for downtown. And
That's right. 'Cause we
their
use those.
guidelines, I don't think they're actively used.
Right.
They're well done.
They are. It's a good
And if
document.
we could kind of get that into the zoning and,
That was one of the
Right.
things we had sort of a design guidelines subcommittee, but there wasn't any
Right.
precedent for it. So again, this might be,
Right.
I don't know whether this would go in housing or somewhere to be included as a
Right.
general
I think we need
vision
to.
or goal here
I
in some
think
way.
I'd like to sort of throw something out for people to think about
Okay.
between now and the next time we come back to talk about land use. I would say that one of the observations that planning professionals make when they see a zoning map of Brattleboro is that there's too many colours on it, which is to say there are simply too many zoning districts. And that there's some zoning districts which are, the differences between one zoning district and another are so subtle as to be lost on anybody but a practicing expert. And so there's a couple of things that come from that. I think over time we've had two trends going on in town that are worth reflecting on as the Planning Commission. and planning staff. One is that we tend to zone in response to neighbourhood concerns, acute, very, very tightly focused on a particular neighbourhood, and not necessarily with reference to what Chapter 117 politely refers to as orderly development for the whole community, right? So there's that one. And there's definitely a tension there. There's definitely a tension that the Planning Commission needs to sort of get right in terms of how much do you listen to the people who are actually before you asking for a change, and how much do you consider what they're asking for with reference to the wider frame, which would be the entire town. So there's that one. Then there's the other one, which is, I think what we've attempted to do over time is write zoning district language that almost substitutes for design guidelines or design controls. So the narrative that comes at the beginning of each different section of the zoning ordinance that describes the subtle differences between commercial industrial and industrial commercial, for instance. In case you weren't paying attention, they're different. Because one's pink and one's not so pink. It's kind of lost on the ordinary user and the ordinary property owner, and they think it's a game. And what it really amounts to is that we actually, in our minds here, are trying to sort of describe a difference between, say, commercial industrial and industrial commercial. But what we really need to do is talk about the guidelines and the criteria for site plan review, and the guidelines and criteria for implementing design guidelines, because that's what we're really trying to achieve through the side door here. And so we should have far fewer zoning districts and far clearer language about what's supposed to go on, and then the much harder, I might say, there's some ancient Greek word I'm supposed to insert in here, the task here before us, I think it's to do with elephant poop or something, is try and convince the community that living with design guidelines is appropriate for this kind of community, and that it doesn't matter where you fall on the map, you should really you should be in a situation where you have to address the design guidelines as they're written. So that's a land use chapter discussion or
10
not.
seconds left.
Right.
2 minutes.
You'd like us to think about whether we ought to have fewer, simpler zoning in town.
Yep.
And, did you say form-based code?
No, those words did not come out of my
No,
mouth.
they didn't.
I'm going to say it.
Okay.
And chimera was the word you were looking for.
Ooh,
Why was
really?
it?
I don't know. I thought it had to do with.
Nothing. Liz?
Okay.
Is there a process by which the Development Review Board reports on the trends that they've seen and how they would relate to potential zoning changes?
Yes.
Really good question.
They don't
We do
formally
once a year
report,
with them.
It's a great
but we have an
question.
annual meeting with them, right?
Yeah, which we didn't have last year.
Which we didn't have last year.
That's right.
Semi-annual meeting, yeah.
And they do tell us lots of funny anecdotes about permitting for chickens. So which has been the major trend, I'd say, that we've observed.
And will that get into here?
Hopefully not. Hopefully we'll have something slightly more important to talk about in
No,
this
no,
section.
not the chickens,
Yeah.
but the trends.
The trends,
Brian
yes.
communicates.
Yes. Yeah, it does. Yeah, we can do that. And I think it is an important point to include.
Great question. We did it
Yeah.
a year ago, summer,
Right.
2 years ago this summer.
I have another,
And we did about 20 different changes, and we did them at a joint meeting, and it was great.
so does that come under objectives number 2, establish guidance for design to achieve high-quality development? That would sort of cover
Yes.
what you just.
I might even
partially.
want to go a little bit
could
more
strengthen.
specific than that, strengthen it.
Yeah. And where you wrote promote, on number 4 goals, promote development that is environmentally sensitive, what does that exactly mean? And we've talked in the past
Gentle.
about like orientation to the sun and LEED
Uh,
guidelines and being more energy efficient in
Well, I wasn't
land
thinking
use.
of energy efficient, but, I mean, that could be
No, I know
part of
you
it.
were,
It
but
could
I'm
be the
just
low
adding
impact
another
development.
aspect to that.
It can be, let's fix our definition of open space and
Yes.
land unit development.
No.
So that when we're setting aside open space, it's not just all the unbuildable land.
No, so that the corridors line up maybe instead of being
Right.
patchwork. But I
It's,
just
you
am
know-
bringing up the other piece of
Right.
energy efficient. I don't see those words.
We-
But it's like, creating a subdivision so that you can cluster them and not have the road so long and the.
We're a little constrained in terms of
It's a goal.
implementing strict requirements around say passive solar. I mean, what I think there is that would be something that I would hope would turn up in design guidelines, and so there are just limits to how far you can take that, particularly with residential housing.
Maybe I'm
With
thinking that it
residential
happens in
units.
bigger cities, like the governor of Massachusetts, any new state buildings have to be
Sure.
conform to this, or like
Yeah.
Portland, Oregon has a sustainable coordinator,
Yep.
and they put
Yep.
that kind of stuff into practice.
Yeah, that's not a problem. No, yeah, they're
Maybe we're just,
the limits are
Yeah.
there's certain categories of land development that we can't go there with that.
so how about, where does, if we want to like, I mean, I know down in Cotton Mill Hill, it's all artists and studios and incubator for small creative businesses. But lots of places have studio space and residential in the same buildings. They've taken and redone old factories and created studio space, but people can actually live there. And does the zoning here prevent that? That's another kind of infill.
No, that's a choice on the part of the owners of the building that they don't want people living there. There's
So
nothing.
there's
think
nothing
there's
that
any
would
barrier.
prohibit
There's nothing in the zoning that would prevent you from doing that. I would say they might have some pretty serious physical constraints about water supply and plumbing
Yeah.
and those kinds of.
But I mean, there's a lot of empty, funky buildings around, like the way the housing,
Sure.
Wyndham Housing people took the old, I guess
Yep.
it was Baskerville owned it on
Yeah.
Bird Street and converted that into
Yep.
housing.
Sure.
But, I mean, in a lot of big cities, they have combined studio,
Yes.
music places and
Yeah, it's
residences.
very common in mill towns throughout New England,
yeah,
Bellows
yeah.
Falls. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
like in
You couldn't do
California.
that in R1 though, could you?
Residential?
Residential one? No, you
They're
can.
not gonna have,
You can have an
they won't have
accessory
warehouses.
apartment.
You can have an accessory apartment.
Well, yeah, you'll have
But,
garages.
but
and
how about in
barns and-
R1, taking, if you had a big enough lot, like I lived in Berkeley for 3 years, and there's plenty of houses there that have a small cottage in the backyard that they wouldn't call an accessory, or maybe a big house in the front and 2 small ones in the back.
Sure.
And is that, I mean,
That might be
I don't think that's allowable here. I think
You can
Depend.
have one
the-
accessory apartment and you
Does not need
can't
to
be
be connected to the
denied.
main house?
Doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't have to be
Could
connected
to the
over
main
a
house.
garage or.
It can be above a barn or a garage.
Laura and Caleb just doing that
Yeah,
on
that's what
Pine
they're
Street.
doing now,
That's coming
yeah.
before the
Right.
DRB.
So we are past 8
Yes.
o'clock. I said we would end this at 8 o'clock tonight. I appreciate everybody's input. Dana, thanks for the memories. And do come back and see us. At Scratch Fever, that's right, number 1, right? And thanks for coming, members of the public,
Yeah, thanks for being there.
Thanks a lot.
media person.
We can have an
And,
The
adjournment.
peanut gallery
Oh,
back
you-
there.
Say
Is
adjourn.
there a motion
to
for
adjourn.
adjournment?
I second.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed?